And good evening, everyone. My name is Evan Weiner. Thanks to Trish for inviting me to the Mendham Library. I have a radio and TV background. I started as an 11th grader in 1971 in Spring Valley, New York, Spring Valley High School. And I had a teacher by the name of Joe Dionisio. He was an English teacher. He said, you have a good voice, student. Always called me student, and I still deal with him 49 years later. And he said, how would you like to be on radio? And I said, I want to be on radio the worst way. And I was on the show called Tiger Talk on WRKL radio. And it was one of the worst shows ever, but I got to meet people who helped me out to become a professional broadcaster. Joe also opened the door for me at the Nyack Journal News and the Hackensack Record. By 1978, I was on WNEW AM radio. Remember WNEW AM radio?
Oh, yeah.
William B. Williams. And but I was doing news, and I got on because I got a scoop. I was 21 years old. John Lindsay said to me, I'm running for the Senate, state of New York in 1980, and run back to my 500-watt radio station, WGRC, file it. Then I additionally called AP-UPI, filed it. I get a call from Henry Marcotte from WNEW, and he said, how'd you like to do that story for us? I said, fine, how much you can pay me? He said, $10. I said, sold. And so I was on WNEW. Among the stories I covered for WNEW, interviewed Ronald Reagan one-on-one in 1980 when I was 23. Interviewed Ted Kennedy in New Jersey at the Mahwah Ford plant when it was closing in 1980, and other stories along the way, and the Brinks robbery in Nyack, New York in 1981. Then I went on to other things. 1967 reminds me of a Mills Brothers song. You say you will, and then you won't, and all that, because there's so many contradictions in 1967. You're looking at a picture of Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was a guy who said, what was it? Turn on, tune in, and drop out. And he was an advocate of taking acid, and he's talking to a crowd here in San Francisco at the Golden Gate Bridge Park area, talking about, yeah, you should use some drugs and all of that. So there is Timothy Leary, and there is Newark, New Jersey. During the riots in Newark, New Jersey, which were in July. And you had Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band released on June 1st, 1967. And roughly at that time, in early June, you also had the Six-Day War in Israel between Egypt and Syria. Jimmy played Monterey, Jimi Hendrix at Monterey. And Ronald Reagan, not too far from Monterey, was the governor of California in his first year of his first term. Now, the question is, was 1967 the summer of love or the summer of war? Actually, it was both. While there were hippies in San Francisco, there was a war in Vietnam, and there was a war in the Middle East. Timothy Leary, the psychologist, told 30,000, well, we could call them hippies, just simply shorthand. They weren't all hippies. He told 30,000 people in Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, turn on, tune in, and drop out. There was rioting in the streets of Detroit and in Newark, New Jersey. You could call these people hippies. We don't know exactly what a hippie was. They left no literature, no ideology. They were there overnight and left. This was a picture. I was in San Francisco last November. It seems like years ago before COVID. But I was doing cruise ship up and down California instead of going up and down I-5. Hey, do the cruise ship and do some talks. Anyway, this was in a bread making store. They had a little museum about the Fisherman's Wharf and the Summer of Love. The hippie counterculture movement culminated with the Summer of Love. By the fall, sayings like feeling groovy gave way to make love, not war, chants as youth protested the escalating conflict in Vietnam and staged marches and sit-ins on behalf of civil rights. But again, nobody seems to know what a hippie was or the counterculture. It's a term that's thrown out there, but it's never been identified. So in the United States, the summer of 1967 offered two narratives. One was fire bases, napalm, jungles, the draft. The other was communes, LSD, flowers, and rock music. San Francisco was the epicenter of both tales. Because if you go across the Bay Area Bridge into Oakland, you would run across this, the U.S. Army Oakland Port of Embarkation. And for many people going to Vietnam, both men and women, as a woman told me a couple of years ago when I kept referring to the boys in Vietnam, she said, "You're wrong. There were women in Vietnam. There were support staff. They were nurses. Don't forget, there were women in Vietnam. In fact, the first woman who was killed in Vietnam was in 1965, and it was Dickie Chappelle, who was a journalist who was buried with full military honors. The first woman, she was a photographer who was attached in 1965. So there were men and women that left from that place. San Francisco Bay Area was often the last place a service member would see before heading off to the war. By 1967, the United States commitment in Vietnam had escalated to 500,000 military personnel, from 23,000 men starting in January of 1965, and about 200,000 of those in Vietnam, or 40%, shipped out from the Oakland Army base. Some also shipped out from San Diego. Again, back to the bread making place in the wharf. Hippies converge on Haight-Ashbury. 70 million baby boomers came of age in the 1960s. The first was the 18-year-olds in 1964, and you could count Donald Trump, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, all turned 18 in 1964. And they advocated free speech, free love, and psychedelic enlightenment. Between 1966 and 1968, the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood became the scene of the hippie movement and gave rise to San Francisco rock sounds, artists, the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, Janice Joplin. Well, she was from Texas, but she was in the Bay Area. Moby Gray, Country Joe and the Fish. Country Joe and the Fish had an anti-war song before they became popular in the early part of the 1960s. The Great Society, and the Steve Miller Band. 67 was also the first year of the Super Bowl, except it wasn't called the Super Bowl. Played on January 15th, 1967. It was the American Football League, National Football League World Championship game. And it was played before a 2/3 packed stadium, the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. 66 or 61,000 or so people there, about 33,000 empty seats. The Green Bay Packers would beat Kansas City 35-10. There was tragedy. The space race is heating up. John Kennedy in 1961 said Americans had to go to the moon by the end of the decade. Now, Kennedy wasn't really into the space race program. He just wanted to see American astronauts on the moon before Soviet astronauts in 1969, 1970. In fact, if Kennedy ran for re-election, there was a good chance that funding for the space program would have been substantially cut. Lyndon Johnson, who used to be the majority leader, or was the majority leader of the Senate in the 1950s, made sure that that did not happen. Anyway, these three guys, Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Senator Roger Chaffee, 31 years old, on the right from Rhode Island, were killed on the launch pad in January of 1967. I have a friend by the name of Dick Hull who worked for NASA between 1960 and 1975. And he was telling me that it was miraculous that men actually were able to get to the moon because NASA cut corners and did things that were thoroughly unsafe, like this thing here. Apollo 1, or Apollo 202, was supposed to be the first low Earth orbit test of the Apollo Command and Service Module with a crew, and they were supposed to go up February 21st, 1967. Cold War is going on at this point. United States, Soviet Union. The moon is considered a major prize. Whoever gets to the moon gets a big victory in the Cold War. The Cold War was also playing out in Vietnam. A cabin fire during a launch rehearsal test at Cape Kennedy, January 27th. It was 27th, not February, in January. Killed all 3 crew members and destroyed the command module. Dick Hull actually heard the final 60 seconds of Grissom, White, and Chafee's life. He said it was grisly and you would not want to ever hear what happened. And it's never been released. What happened? There was a spark inside the command craft, and the command craft was being not powered, but they were pouring oxygen in, pure oxygen in a rehearsal, which Dick said was totally uncalled for. And it blows up, and there is not much left. In fact, the bodies were intertwined, and spacesuits melted into the bodies, and it would actually set back NASA 18 months. Could have set back the schedule to get to the moon, but Dick said they were determined to get ahead of it, and they did. While that's going on, the Smothers Brothers become a TV entity on CBS, February 5th. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was different. CBS was looking to get out of the rule programming. They had Gomer Pyle, and they had Andy Griffith, and they had the Beverly Hillbillies. They had one of my favorites, Green Acres. I loved Green Acres. And Mr. Ed. They had all these shows along with aging shows like Red Skelton and Lucy and Jackie Gleason, and they'd wheel out Jack Benny here and there. But they had an aged rule television schedule, and CBS decided, you know what, we got to change all of that. What's My Line was still on. And let's bring in these guys. These guys are young. We've had them under contract before in 1963 with another show, and they're comedians, and they do a little folk music, and we need to get younger. And these people will get us younger people, younger viewers. We'll be able to keep some of the Ed Sullivan people. Sullivan was on Sunday night, 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. We're going to get these guys on after the Sullivan show. Well, it was a good idea, except Tommy Smothers was totally against the war, and the show would start with that. The show would feature Steve Martin as a writer, a young guy by the name of Rob Reiner as a writer, Mason Williams, who had the hit Classical Gas, also on the show. Eventually, David Steinberg would be on as well, and David Steinberg would be 2.5 years later would end the Smothers Brothers show with a routine about Moses in the burning bush on the David Steinberg sermonettes. But CBS thought they had pure gold with these guys, and they did. They actually did. These guys brought them the viewers that they wanted, a young, hip crowd, people in their 20s, early 30s, professional with young children, some disposable income. That's what CBS wanted. They got it, but they also got a show that was against the war. And in primetime TV in those days, there weren't any shows against the war in Vietnam. On April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King gave his anti-Vietnam War speech at the Riverside Church in Upper Manhattan, a year to the day. Well, actually, because 68 was a leap year, 366 days. But a year to the day that Martin Luther King would be killed in 1968. In the speech, King stated, somehow this madness must cease. The madness, the war in Vietnam. There is burning your draft card. Actually, burning your draft card in 1967 could end, you could land up in prison for doing this, and you could face up to 2 years for destroying government property. Well, on about April 15th of 1967, in Central Park at the Sheep Meadow, about 60 young men, which included a few students from Cornell, came together and they burnt their draft cards in a Maxwell House coffee can. Wasn't Euban, wasn't Sanka, wasn't Juan Valdez. It was a Maxwell House coffee can that they burnt their draft cards in. None of them went to jail for that. While that was going on, there were protests around the country. This one is in San Francisco. No negotiations, get out. This was against Vietnam. There were protests in other cities like New York that day where they burnt the draft guards, San Francisco, and others. This was all put together by what was called the Spring Mobilization Committee to End the War in Vietnam. It was called Spring Moby Protests, and they had about 300,000 people in the streets. This was a November 1966 movement. That's when it started. And it would be in 1966 that a lot of protests would take place, although the first protests were around as early as 1965. That is Muhammad Ali, heavyweight champion of the world. And he was already a scary guy to some because he was a member of the Nation of Islam. And he also was drafted in 1966, and he refused to enter military service April 25th, 1967, or April 27th, 1967. He goes to Houston and he attends his induction, but he refuses to answer what his name is or take the oath to join the military. So he's arrested on the spot. He is led out of the Houston Recruitment Center. And almost immediately, without any due process, he is stripped of his boxing title and he loses his boxing license in New York and other places. He was not given due process. He was not able to defend himself. He loses his title, loses his source of income, and would be facing jail time, 5 years, and a $10,000 fine. Ali afterwards said, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam, while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights?" I met Ali quite a bit in the 1980s. That's my last picture with Ali in 1985. And at that point, Ali, you couldn't interview him. He couldn't really speak. The Parkinson's had kicked in, as well as 60,000 punches to the head. Was Ali sincere? That was the first question that people wanted to know. In 1968, a group of athletes in Cleveland, including a guy named Walter Beach, who got fired in 1961 from the American Football League Boston Patriots team. The team was supposed to play a preseason game in New Orleans, and Beach did not want to be subjected to Jim Crow laws and told Billy Sullivan and the Patriots brass, you know, I want to be treated like the white guys. And they labeled him a troublemaker and they fired him. He was one of the guys, a very young Lou Alcindor, one of the guys, Jim Brown, and they wanted to know whether he was legit or not. He was legit, they said. And I had a friend, the late Shelley Saltman, who was his promoter, who started working with him in 1971. And Shelley told me that he told Ali in 1971, "I'm a Korean War veteran. I don't like you. I don't think you did the right thing." And he said Ali proceeded to explain to him for 3 hours why he was against the war. And he said, "I believed him." And Shelley worked for him for 7 years and only quit because he didn't want to see the champ battered and bruised in all the fights that he was taking when he was past his prime in the late 1970s. The New York State Athletic Commission stripped him of his license. The WBA stripped him of his world heavyweight title. His career was effectively over. It would restart in 1970. Meanwhile, that is Israel and the Israeli-Arab Six-Day War, which starts in June of 1967. The actual fighting starts in June of 67, but there were things that led up to it. By the mid-1960s, Syrian-backed Palestinian guerrillas began staging attacks across the Israeli border. And that provoked reprisal raids from the Israeli Defense Forces. I just mentioned my friend Shelley Saltman. His cousin Mutti Saltman helped put together the Israeli Defense Forces in 1948. In April of 1967, the skirmishes worsened after Israel and Syria fought an air and artillery engagement. There were 6 Syrian fighter jets destroyed. That is Nasser, president of Egypt, and Nasser is getting increasingly upset at what is going on. in Israel and with Syria. After all, there was once a country called the UAR, which was an amalgamation of Syria and Egypt. In the wake of the April air battle, the Soviet Union provided Egypt with intelligence that Israel was moving troops to its northern border with Syria in preparation for a full-scale invasion. The information was inaccurate, but it got NASA thinking, and it spurred them into some action. And here was the action. In a show of support for his Syrian allies, he ordered Egyptian forces to advance into the Sinai Peninsula. They expelled the United Nations peacekeeping force that had been there for about 10 years after the Suez Canal crisis in the 1950s. And there is one of the UN people that were there to keep the peace. On May 22nd, Nasser banned Israeli shipping from the Straits of Tiran, the sea passage connecting the Red Sea with the Gulf of Aqaba. A week later, he and King Hussein of Jordan signed a defense deal with the king, sending troops if there would be a fight. The Israelis said, stay out of it. There's more pictures from the Six-Day War. In the weeks leading up to the war, the Syrian and Egyptian leaders made no secret of the fact that their joint coalition, they were coming to destroy Israel. At the same time, Israelis are telling Jordan, stay out of this. You have nothing to fight for here. Just stay out of it. You'll get yourself in trouble. On the morning of June 5th, 1967, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault that destroyed 90% of Egypt's air force sitting on the tarmac. A similar air assault incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. And all that was left for Israel after that was to mop up in the desert. Within 3 days, the Israelis achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground, captured the Gaza Strip and all of the Sinai Peninsula up to the east bank of the Suez Canal. And 53 years later, those borders that Israel established then in Gaza and the East Bank are still in question. And there's still no peace between Israel and the Palestinians. This is 53 years now. There is the architect of the Israeli victory, General Moshe Dayan. Israel doubled its size by conquering Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt, the Golan Heights of Syria, and the West Bank. Eventually, they would give back this Sinai Peninsula in part of the peace agreement with Egypt, which was brokered under Jimmy Carter around 1978. Arab leaders met in Khartoum, Sudan, August of '67, and signed a resolution that promised no peace, no recognition, no negotiation with Israel. As the war is going on, these guys are selling albums, selling them like hotcakes. The Beatles, Ringo, John, Paul, and George. It's called Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's an album that just patched songs together, music hall songs, psychedelic songs, Day in the Life, which was banned by the BBC. Probably not the best effort, in my opinion. I like Revolver better, or Abbey Road, but for many, many decades, it was the #1 rock album as far as critics were concerned. It was the #1 hit in Britain between June of '67 and February '68, 27 weeks at the top of the charts, and 148 weeks on the charts altogether. That's almost 3 years. All of this in spite of the BBC ban on the Day in the Life because of the words, I love to turn you on. The album, 15-week stay at the top of the US Top 200 albums in 1967. And during its initial chart run in '67 and '68, it was in the top 200 albums for 88 weeks. Also in June, the Monterey Pop Festival, or the Monterey International Pop Festival. It featured, and wasn't very far from San Francisco. Monterey is about 90, 100 miles south of San Francisco. Featured nearly 36 well-known acts and unknown acts, representing quite a mixture of styles and sounds. Otis Redding was there, and this is one of his last concerts. He would die in a plane crash shortly thereafter. Otis Redding's big hit was not Sitting at the Dock of the Bay, it was Respect, but it was sung by Aretha Franklin. Otis Redding, Ravi Shankar, U. Maskell-Kala had their first significant exposure at the Monterey Pop Festival. Other people there, Eric Burdon and the Animals, the Association, they sung Windy, the Byrds, Jefferson Airplane, the Mamas, and the Papas. The Beach Boys, well, they weren't there. And that led Jimi Hendrix to say, no more of that striped shirt surf music. No more of that striped shirt surf music. Because the Beach Boys used to perform in striped shirts, and it was surf music. Vietnam. Vietnam is still going on, and it's escalating and escalating and escalating. And so are the people in the streets. Johnson is a war criminal. No destruction in Vietnam. How did we get to Vietnam? Well, in 1954, the French pulled out of French Indochina, and that left North Vietnam and South Vietnam at loggerheads. Now, my father told me this story when I was a wee child on his knee. He was in the Army between 1953 and 1955. I was born in 1956. And he said that there were stories going around that he and his group were headed to Vietnam, and ultimately Eisenhower decided not to really get involved in this thing. Vietnam had split into North Vietnam, the communists, and South Vietnam, and we, the United States, backed South Vietnam because of the Cold War. The Cold War anxieties dictated that if North Vietnamese communists prevailed, then you had the domino theory. The rest of Southeast Asia would fall like dominoes. Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, maybe Taiwan, maybe even Australia and New Zealand. When John Kennedy took office in 1961, he vowed that South Vietnam would not fall to communism. By 1963, Kennedy was beginning to have doubts about whether or not the Americans should stay in Vietnam, but there was no indication that he ever during the rest of his lifetime in 1963 was ready to pull troops out. 1964, Gulf Tonkin Resolution gave Lyndon Johnson all the power he needed to escalate the war. In January of 1965, 5,400 men were called up for the draft. By December of that year, more than 45,000 were called. The monthly draft rose from 17,000 to 35,000 a month by 1967, and young people started to go in the streets and demonstrate. Joan Baez was one of those who decided, hey, Vietnam, not worth it. Joan Baez retired last year, sung a string of anti-war songs. George Harrison would visit Haight-Ashbury, and he was not very impressed with his trip to Haight-Ashbury. He's away from the Beatles now, and even though the Beatles are still together, and he starts traveling freely, as all the other Beatles did, no longer held together because they weren't touring anymore. And his observation of Haight-Ashbury was not very, well, let's put it this way, he didn't think very highly of it. Haight-Ashbury, that's the district in San Francisco, Timothy Leary's people. A community based upon what was called counterculture. Not sure what the counterculture is because nobody's ever come up with a real definition of it. But anyway, for this purpose, counterculture ideals, drugs, and music. The neighborhood offered a gathering spot to create a social experiment that would soon spread throughout the nation. The hippie community had easy access to drugs, which was perceived as a community unifier. There were people called the Diggers around there, and they were formed in the mid to late 1960s, and if anybody were real hippies, it was the Diggers, or if anybody had any philosophy for hippies, it was the Diggers. They believed in free society and the good in human nature. They established a free store, gave out free meals daily, and built a free medical clinic, which relied on volunteers and donations. I gave this talk in Norwalk, Connecticut, no, Fairfield, Connecticut, about 3 years ago. And it was a senior home, and this woman who was in her 70s, very prim and proper in her 70s, told me that by day she was a bank officer in Oakland, and by night she was going to San Francisco. I said, did you wear flowers in your hair? And she laughed and she said, yes. Scott McKenzie, his big hit. San Francisco, actually written by John Phillips, the Mamas and Papas. San Francisco, be sure to wear some flowers in your hair. Hey, you're going to be a hippie? Dress the part. The Scott McKenzie song, San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, became a hit. The Monterey Pop Festival cemented the status of psychedelic music as part of the culture and elevated the local Haight-Ashbury bands, Grateful Dead, Big Brother. Janice Joplin would join Big Brother in the holding company and Jefferson Airplane to stardom. Now, who went to San Francisco? Well, I asked the woman, bank executive by day and partier by night. She said, I saw a whole bunch of people. Summer Love attracted a wide range of people, various ages, teenagers and college students, drawn by their peers and the allure of joining a cultural utopia, middle-class vacationers, and even parting military personnel from bases within driving distance, such as Oakland. They were all there. But it wasn't all fun and games, and eventually, the hippies would die. On October 6, 1967, the death of the hippie. Those are the Diggers. The funeral of the hippie. Haight-Ashbury deteriorated. Overcrowding, homelessness, hunger, drug problems, crime afflicted the neighborhood. Also, a lot of those college students said, okay, had enough make-believe playing. It's time to go back to our real lives. And they went back to their college studies. I asked the woman, bank executive by day, San Francisco partier by night, I said, was this true? She said, absolutely, and she left the area and stayed in Oakland. The Diggers had the death of the hippie ceremony. George Harrison said of his experience, that's him with his first wife, Patty Boyd, I went there expecting it to be a brilliant place with groovy gypsy people making works of art and painting and carvings and little workshops, but it was filled with horrible, spotty, dropout kids on drugs. Turned me right off the scene. I can only describe it like a Bowery, a lot of bums and dropouts, many of them very young kids who dropped acid and come from all over America to this mecca of LSD. Apparently, George Harrison didn't dig it. Meanwhile, Ronald Reagan is the governor of California. He's in his first term as governor of California, and he's in Sacramento. Sacramento is so, I would say, I've made the trip many times between San Francisco and Sacramento, depending on the kind of traffic and the time of day you live, could be leave 2 hours or 4 hours. It's just like here in New Jersey and New York. And this is what Ronald Reagan, or somebody wrote for Ronald Reagan who knew how to read his lines. He was quick with a quip. A hippie is someone who looks like Tarzan, walks like Jane, and smells like Cheetah. Newark, New Jersey, on the other side of the United States. Newark, New Jersey. And when I give talks in the Union County area, when I'm in Livingston or Milburn or Springfield, in that area, or Westfield, and I'll give talks at libraries and senior homes and clubs in that area. Inevitably, in the West Orange JCC as well, inevitably I will do one of these 60s talks, and it gets back to the Newark Riots. And these people lived as kids in Newark and didn't move very far. In fact, you draw a circle around Newark, they all moved like 8 miles away, Livingston, Springfield, Milburn, and all those other places. And they said, we had relatives who owned these stores in Newark. And some of these stores were saved because the rioters knew their families and left the stores alone, didn't touch the stores. Withdraw the troops from Newark, Youth Against War and Fascism, Free Our Black Brothers, No Vietnam, and so on and so forth, the demonstrations in Newark. It was a rough summer. There was no dancing in the streets. Erupting primarily in the East Coast and Midwestern cities. I said dancing in the streets because the FBI actually analyzed the lyrics of that song, Dancing in the Streets, all the cities that are mentioned in there, because they thought there'd be trouble in every city. And they thought that J. Edgar Hoover thought that dancing in the street was a call to arms. J. Edgar Hoover. Anyway, Milwaukee, Buffalo, Tampa, Cincinnati. more than 100 deaths in those particular places, hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage, and scores of burnt out neighborhoods, some of which never recovered. Go to Detroit, you can see that today. That is Newark, New Jersey. That is the National Guard making sure that this kid is on his way. Here is what happened that summer, June 27th. A riot erupted in Buffalo. They were called race riots in 1967. Now they're called insurrections or rebellions, as history writers have reviewed what happened all those years ago. 200 people were arrested. The race riot in Newark, 26 people dead, 1,500 injured, 1,000 arrested. Race riots in Cairo, Illinois, July 17th. Race riots in Durham, North Carolina, July 19th. July 23rd through 27th, 43 people die in a race riot in Detroit. 1,000 people were injured, 442 fires were set. There was also rioting in Plainfield, New Jersey as well during 1967. July 24th, riots erupted in Cambridge, Maryland. Race riots in Detroit forced the postponement, easy for me to say, of a Tigers-Orioles game. There's a guy saying, leave my business alone. Puts up the plywood, soul brother, just leave my business alone, I'm okay. Yeah, you know what? There were people who were gladly ready to lend a hand against these riots. This picture is from Louisiana, and this guy is trying to volunteer to join the Louisiana National Guard in keeping the peace in Louisiana. The unrest was a reaction to a larger problem. Deep-seated anger and hopelessness simmering in many disenfranchised urban communities where rates of poverty, joblessness, and crime were disproportionately high. Here's John Lindsay. Excuse me while I genuflect to John Lindsay. Thank you, John. I had a radio career because of you on New York radio. Anyway, there's John Lindsay along with Lyndon Johnson. The guy on the left is Otto Kerner. He is the governor of governor of Illinois. And Lyndon Johnson asks Kerner to chair a commission to find out why there was rioting in the streets. After all, 3 years earlier, Lyndon Johnson did sign into law, July 7th, 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was effectively supposed to end Jim Crow, give equal rights to everybody, except women. Women did not get equal rights in that 1964 Civil Rights Act for education. That would be taken care of in 1972 with Title IX regulations. Anyway, Kerner has got all these people, including John Lindsay, who was the mayor of New York at that point, and they are supposed to find out, hey, how do we fix this situation? The Kerner Commission, Johnson gets bipartisan task force. Lindsay was a Republican, Kerner was a Democrat. Lindsay would become a Democrat eventually. And it was called the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, or the Kerner Commission, named after the chair, the Illinois governor, Otto Kerner. And the committee asked these three major questions. What happened? Why did it happen? What can be done to prevent it happening again? And there he is. It's my man, John Lindsay, right in the front there, next to Lyndon Johnson. Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, is in the back. Anyway, the report is given to Lyndon Johnson. And the conclusions were, create 2 million new jobs and 6 million new affordable housing units. Revamp the welfare system. Eliminate de facto school segregation. Eliminate abrasive police practices in establishing redress mechanisms. Now, here's one that I know exists because I've been in the news. Improving news coverage of the problems facing Black Americans. Local news today is murder, mayhem, entertainment, sports, and weather. They were talking about that in 1967, they being Kerner, Lindsay, and others. Make local government more responsive to inner city communities. Lyndon Johnson accepted the report, initially liked it, And it came out in 1968, March of 1968, as a bestseller on the nonfiction list of the New York Times. I don't think you probably have it in your library, but if you do, it's a 52-year-old book. It sold 2 million copies, but it all but disappears. It's gone. It's not around. They sell it, it's not, nothing happens. Because Lyndon Johnson was kind of upset because he figured he'd get a lot of praise and pats on the back for the Civil Rights Act, and yet the commission, in his mind, didn't give him enough credit for the civil rights legislation. And there was the 64 Civil Rights Act. 1965, there was the Voter Rights Act. Also, they got rid of the poll taxes in 1964, but that was a constitutional amendment that Johnson really didn't have too much to do with, rather. Johnson later refused to support further research or meet with the commissioners. He has a fit, and that's that. The book is out there somewhere. The National Organization for Women, that's Betty Friedan's group that started in 1966. This is the second civil rights movement that has erupted in the United States. You got the Martin Luther King Black movement in the South. This is the Organization for Women, and they start making demands. 1966 is when Betty Friedan founded it. Back in 1961, 62, somewhere along the lines, Betty Friedan went back to Smith College to interview her former classmates 15 years after they had graduated. And she wanted to know how they were faring in life. And she found out that a lot of them were very upset. Here they were, smart women, and all they were doing was raising families and cooking dinner and weren't using their intelligence. Betty Friedan wanted to write a magazine article for, I don't know, Newsweek, Time, Life, Look, whatever the magazines were around in 1962. And they turned her all down. In 1963, she authored the book called The Feminine Mystique, which possibly is in the library, should be in the library. And that is the start of the women's liberation movement. And they would pick up steam in 1967 and 1968. In 1968, because you're a New Jersey crowd, let me just tell you, they organized the protest of the Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. The protest didn't work, but there was a catchphrase that came out of it that got people's attention. Will you burn your bra? Or did you burn your bra? The bra burning movement. And it was a great marketing ploy. It got people interested because they mentioned the bra. And then they were able to talk about all of this other stuff that they wanted. Tax deduction, this is from 1967, but obviously they used it in 1968. Tax deduction for home and child care expenses for working parents. Child daycare centers, equal in non-gender segregated education. That doesn't come until 1972. Equal job training opportunities and allowances for women in poverty, and the right of women to control their reproductive lives. If you take a look at this picture, and if I was with you live, I would say, is Jock Semple committing an assault on Kathy Schweitzer? And you would answer. And you can answer that right now in chat if you want. Is this an assault or not? I'll give you, if you want to answer, I'll give you 5 or 10 seconds if you want to type something in or just say something. This is the Boston Marathon in 1967. And Jock Semple is really, really, really upset with Catherine Switzer and is about ready to knock her onto the ground to get her out of the race. The person to the left, the guy, is Switzer's boyfriend. And he's accompanying her, and things would not end well for Jock Semple. Catherine Switzer grew up as the daughter of a major in the United States Army, so failure was never really an option for her. She went to Syracuse University, and she told one of her coaches, she told that she was going to run the Boston Marathon. And he told her, "You're a frail woman. You can't run for the Boston Marathon." Frail women, that goes back to Patsy Mink, who was one of the authors of Title IX that was signed by Nixon in '72, that provided same road for men and women in colleges. And back in 1944, she was at Maui University. She became the congresswoman of in Hawaii and was one of the authors of Title IX. And she could only play half-court basketball because women were not physically strong enough to run 96 feet. They could only run 48 feet. That was thinking back in those days. So she trained in secret and entered the race. And Jock is about ready to knock over Kathy, and the boyfriend, who was a track and field guy, comes over and makes sure that Kathy is continuing to run, and Jock hits the ground. But if you look at it, it's solid cement. And if he pushes her down and she gets her face hit or something, she can break a nose, break a cheekbone, break teeth. This is assault. People who work for the marathon physically tried to pull her out of the race. Jock Stemple tried to remove her physically by pushing her. Kathy's boyfriend, who was 235 pounds, a nationally ranked hammer thrower, running the race next to Kathy, decided to push Semple to the ground. She would finish the race. She wasn't a dainty, frail thing. She finished the race in 4 hours and 20 minutes. Greece, there's a coup in Greece. April 21st, 1967, 30 years of national division between the forces of the left and right. And that goes back to about 1944, after the liberation of Greece, at the time of the Axis occupation of Greece and the resistance. Greece descended into a civil war fought between communist forces and this government that's returned in exile. And they did return. And the Greek people didn't like them. Torture, repression, murder, guilty, Greek military junta. Long live a democratic Greece. They would last for about 5 or 6 or 7 years. There was significant limitations on individuals' rights. Free elections were suspended. It was illegal to strike, to demonstrate, to talk against the government, and to congregate for any purpose except for church. By 1974, that regime was gone. You might remember the old CARE commercials on TV. Send money now, we'll get food for the children of Biafra. Biafra was part of southern Nigeria, and the Biafran area tried to break away from Nigeria. It was a civil war. The Republic of Biafra, a state in West Africa, was started May 30th, 1967, made up of states in the eastern region of Nigeria. Here are some of the Biafran soldiers. The war officially starts on July 6, 1967. Biafra represented nationalist aspirations of the Biafran people, whose leadership felt they could no longer coexist with a northern-dominated federal government. Biafra would last until January of 1970. The English joined in with the Nigerians, and they were cut off. Their chief city, oil city, Port Harcourt, was cut off. Biafra was formally recognized by Gabon, Haiti, Ivory Coast, Tanzania, and Zambia. Other nations that provided support included Israel, France, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Rhodesia, South Africa, Vatican City. Lyndon Johnson is nowhere to be found here. By 1968, Nigerian troops surrounded Biafra, capturing the coastal oil facilities and the city of Port Harcourt. The blockade led to mass starvation. The war would last a little more than 2.5 years, 100,000 military casualties, about 500,000 to 2 million Biafran civilians would die of starvation. That is the short-lived flag of Biafra. Eventually, the Biafrans would surrender to the Nigerian federal military government. That's the Loving family. That's the Loving family. They got married in Washington, D.C., moved to Virginia, and their marriage was considered illegal until 1967. The Supreme Court of the United States heard arguments in the Loving versus Virginia case, April 1967. The case centered around Mildred Jeter, Black woman, and Richard Loving, a white man. interracial couple from Virginia that got married and lived in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s. They decided to go back to Virginia. They get back there, they're arrested, charged with breaking the state law which banned interracial marriage, and they were jailed. The Lovings sued the state of Virginia and argued that the ban violated the 14th Amendment and was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court took up the case and ruled in a 6-3 decision in June of 1967 that state bans on interracial marriage were unconstitutional, and they were solely based on racial discrimination. The decision made interracial marriage legal throughout the United States. At that point, there were about 17 states that banned it. Later on that year, this movie came out, To Sir with Love, with Sidney Poitier, who in 1964 was the first African-American to win a major award at the Academy Awards. Guess Who's Coming to Dinner was one of the few films at the time to depict an interracial couple or marriage in a positive light. Interracial marriage historically had been illegal in most states of the United States, still illegal in 17 states, mostly in the South, until June 12, 1967, 6 months before that film was released. This guy looks like kill, kill, kill. University of Wisconsin. He is not happy. I don't know if he's happy, not happy because he's facing police, or he's not happy because he may be stoned, or he's not happy because he hates Vietnam. Now, the first protest on a campus wasn't against the Vietnam War per se. It was in late February of 1967. University of Wisconsin-Madison students blocked offices in Bascom Hall to protest the recruitment efforts on the campus of Dow Chemical. And Dow Chemical was making napalm, and they were looking for scientists. And the students decided, you're not coming on our campus to recruit people to make napalm. The students would organize another round of protests against Dow. That would be October 17th and 18th, 1967. And that got the attention of Walter Cronkite, of Chet Huntley, and David Brinkley, of Howard K. Smith, Network TV. Just like the protest in Birmingham, Alabama, the civil rights protests in 1963, May of 63, caught their attention. It was on TV. This is on TV, and people are tuning in, and they're looking at the protests at the University of Wisconsin, and there would be a big march in Washington, D.C. on October 18th. The protests became violent in Washington. The cameras were there to capture it. The Vietnam War not only was being played out on TV from Vietnam, but now in the streets of American cities. The protests made national news at Madison and was the forefront of the anti-war movement. It started student demonstrations. And there is Washington, D.C., outside the Pentagon, with protesters, the March on Washington in 1967 against the Vietnam War. U.S. troops used rifles in their encounter with anti-war demonstrators who were unarmed outside the Pentagon, outside of Washington, D.C., across the river in Arlington, across the Potomac on October 21st, 1967. And there's an even bigger protest on the Mall near the White House, near the Capitol building in Washington. Meanwhile, in Wakefield, Massachusetts, there are 25,000 people who come out to support the American troops. The anti-war demonstration, or anti-demonstration of the demonstrations of the war was sponsored by a 19-year-old high school student in Wakefield by the name of Paul Christopher, who became tired of anti-Vietnam War demonstrations. The music is out there. Not plentiful yet, starting to get there. Bob Dylan, Blowing in the Wind. Phil Oakes, What Are You Fighting For? Maguire, Barry Maguire, Eve of Destruction. Phil Oakes, I Ain't Marching Anymore. And Tom Paxson, Lyndon Told the Nation, talking about the Gulf of Tonkin. In 1966, The Ballad of the Green Berets, Staff Sergeant Barry Sadler was on the Ed Sullivan Show, and this record sold like hotcakes as well in 1966 after he's on the Sullivan Show. Sadler wrote the Ballad of the Green Beret in honor of James Gabriel, who was a Hawaiian Green Beret member executed by the Viet Cong. January 30th, 1966, Sadler debuted on television on the Ed Sullivan Show. It sold 2 million copies within 5 weeks. When I traveled without a mask, I was actually in the Berkshires this year with a mask on. A couple of years ago, I stopped by the Guthrie Center at the Old Trinity Church to revisit Arlo Guthrie because Alice's Restaurant came out in 1967. And for those of you who listen to FM Progressive Radio, you know every Thanksgiving they play that song, 17.5 minutes long, by Arlo Guthrie called Alice's Restaurant. What is Alice's Restaurant? Well, Arlo Guthrie could not get into the Army because he littered. Arlo Guthrie in 1965 is arrested and convicted of dumping trash illegally, which later leads him to being rejected by his draft board, Whitehall and Marks, Lower Manhattan, due to his criminal record of littering. There was a movie called Alice's Restaurant as well. The Berkshire Eagle, which is on the main street in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, reported on November 29th, 1965, the conviction of Richard J. Robbins, age 19, and Arlo Guthrie, age 18, both of the Bronx, for illegally disposing of rubbish. They get a $25 fine each in an order to remove the trash. The arresting officer was Stockbridge Police Chief William J. Obaham, Officer Obie in the song, and the trial was presided over by a special judge, James E. Hannon. It identifies the incriminating evidence as an envelope addressed to a male resident of Great Barrington, presumably Ray Brock, rather than Guthrie. Guthrie writes the song, and it's interpreted as an anti-war song. Guthrie says not necessarily. He said he did believe there were things as just wars. The message of this song is that it wasn't an anti-war song. It was just an anti-stupidity song because he littered. The Army wouldn't take him in, and he's lumped in with killers and rapists and other people. And he's the other guys in the room waiting to be called after being separated. Say, "Hey kid, what are you in for?" And he said, "Littering." And he said they all ran away from him. Meanwhile, another song came out in 1967. This was a Burt Bacharach, Hal David song, written, the lyrics anyway, by Hal David, "I Say a Little Prayer." And it was done in 1965 as the Vietnam War is ramping up. "I Say a Little Prayer." It's not a pro-war song. It's not an anti-war song. Hal David tried to convey a woman's concern for her man who's serving in Vietnam. "I Say a Little Prayer" was recorded by Dionne Warwick of Newark, New Jersey. Got to get the New Jersey stuff in there, right? April 9th, 1966. Burt Bacharach did 10 takes of it, disliked the song. He thought that the song was rushed. Anyway, the track sat until September of 1967. Then it came out. "I Say a Little Prayer" is about a guy serving in Vietnam. Again, not anti-war, not pro-war. Just what are people left behind thinking? And that was what Hal David tried to do with this particular song. So there are songs coming out all over the place. Twiggy hits it big in the United States in 1967. She gets the Beatles treatment. Twiggy arrives in New York. She's the supermodel, arrives in New York, March of 1967 at Kennedy Airport. She gets the Beatles treatment. The New Yorker, Life, and Newsweek reported on the Twiggy phenomenon. Leslie Hornby. In 1967, the New Yorker devoted 100 pages to her. She became an international sensation, modeling in France, Japan, and America. One of my favorite movies, First Night of Hanukkah too, for those who are celebrating. And since I celebrate, I've decided I'm giving myself 8 days of presents. 8 days of presents means I'm going to watch or listen to something from Mel Brooks. And The Producers was released in 1967. It's a cult classic today, big Broadway hit, but it was nothing when it came out in 1967. Except there's one thing in this movie in 1967, one scene that is used still to this day. The Producers is a satirical comedy film written and directed by Mel Brooks. Melvin Kaminsky won an Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. What happened to Mel Brooks? Anyway, decades later, the film was selected to be saved forever by the National Film Registry and placed 11th on the AFI's 100 Years, 100 Laughs list. Now, the term is creative accounting. It's first used ever in the movie The Producers. And I could recite the entire dialogue, but I'll save that. I'll just give you the example where it comes from. Leo Bloom is thinking, he said, you could actually make money with a flop. And he keeps talking about, you could make money. And Max Bialystock is a shyster. Used to have big success on Broadway, but now is being kept alive by little old ladies giving him $100 or so. And he hears Leo Bloom saying, it's possible you could make money on a flop. Bialystock, he keeps saying that, but you don't tell me how. How could a producer make more money with a flop than a hit? Leo Bloom, it's simply a matter of creative accounting. Let us assume just for a moment that you're a dishonest man. Assume away, I'm not going to give you the rest. Creative accounting, still used today. I got one of these. You probably have one of these, right? Well, this guy has his own version of that phone in Japan in 1967. They were working on phones like that, 1966, 1967, and you could have owned one of those phones for just $1,300 US dollars. The multi-channel video phone was invented and installed by the Nippon Electric Company, costing $1,300 for a one-channel setup in 1967. Oh, the computer age. This computer got involved and decided he was going to play chess, or the computer was going to play chess against somebody in Boston. Robert Q, a computer program to play chess, was beaten in its first competition with a human in the monthly Boylston Chess Club tournament in Boston, January 21st, 1967. The computer, that was at MIT across the river in Cambridge. Carl Wagner was the opponent, and he made his moves at the YMCU several miles away in Boston. The moves were relayed to the computer by the old-fashioned way, teletype. Computers usually win now. Expo 67 Montreal. That's me in Montreal in 1982 with one of the things left from Expo 67. Come on, come on. Come to Expo 67 Montreal. The World's Fair, an official World's Fair. The official World's Fair in Seattle, 1962. World's Fair in New York, 1964-65. Never got a stamp of approval from the World's Fair Commission. It was an outlaw, unauthorized World's Fair over in Flushing Meadow that some of you might have gone to. The World's Fair was held in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, April 27th to October 29th of 67, considered to be the most successful World's Fair of the 20th century. It celebrated Canada's 100th anniversary as a nation. And unfortunately, because of COVID-19, I was not able to get up to Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island this year, the way I was supposed to do so in June. That is Confederate Hall in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, sort of like Independence Hall in Philadelphia. And the last year I couldn't get there either, 2019, because we had a major storm and they passed Charlottetown as a port. I wanted to get there and update that picture. But they were rebuilding Confederate Hall. Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, was in Montreal for Expo 67 and caused an international incident in Montreal, speaking from this balcony when he said, "Long live free Quebec." That was July 24th, 1967. De Gaulle gave an international voice to the sovereign movement and caused a diplomatic incident. There were bombings around the Montreal area by a local terrorist group that was looking to break away from Canada. The Prime Minister, Lester B. Pearson, boy, do I hate the Toronto Pearson Airport. As an American, you gotta go through security twice or three times to get to where you wanna go if you're on a connecting flight. Anyway, Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister, criticized the speech, saying de Gaulle's statements were unacceptable to the Canadian people. De Gaulle fled. He went back to France. The 20th century limited passenger train of the New York Central system, it was done in 1967. It was done on December 4th, 1967, the final run to Chicago. The Century began its run between New York and Chicago in 1902, and there it was in better days. On December 3rd, 1967, Dr. Christian Barnard transplanted the heart of an accident victim, Denise Darville, into the chest of a 54-year-old man, Louis Washkensky. Washkensky regained full consciousness and was able to talk to his wife, then contracted pneumonia and died 18 days later. But he was successful, Dr. Barnard. The year ends maybe with a hopeful note, 1967. If you look around, you could see the ravages of war. But here we got two guys sitting on sandbags with a little Christmas tree. In their mind, maybe some hope. They'll get out of Vietnam in 1968. The calendar would flip to 1968, and 1968 would bring on a whole new set of problems. Anyway, thank you so much, everybody, for listening, and thank you, Trish, for inviting me. We will open it up for questions or comments now, because I am done, unless you want me to talk about going to a baseball game at Shea Stadium in 1967. Any questions, comments, observations?
I want to thank you very much for doing this talk tonight. It was absolutely fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Who is that?
That's actually, I'm under Trish Hall, but it's actually Sandy. I'm the program director. I just use my library director Zoom.
No, the reason why I asked is that I turned down the pictures because I'm recording this. I'm going to undo the